perspective on argumentation and argumentative discourse that provides a common rationale to all studies of the fallacies. Because a theory of wrongs cannot be constructed independently of a theory of what is to be considered correct, the theory of fallacies must be an integral part of a normative theory of argumentation that provides well-defined standards for sound argumentative discourse. The theoretical account of the fallacies should be systematically related to these standards in such a way that it's clear in all cases why the fallacies are fallacious. According to the pragmadialectical theory of argumentation, the simplest argumentative situation is that a speaker or writer advances a standpoint and acts as protagonist of that standpoint, and a listener or reader expresses doubt with regard to the standpoint and acts as antagonist. In the discussion that develops, the two parties try to find out whether the protagonist's standpoints can withstand the antagonist's criticisms. In this exchange, an interaction takes place between the speech act performed by the protagonist and the speech act performed by the antagonist that is typical of what we call a critical discussion. This interaction can, of course, lead to the resolution of the difference of opinion only if it proceeds in an adequate fashion, which requires a regulation of the interaction through rules for critical discussion, specifying in which cases the performance of certain speech acts contributes to the resolution of the difference on the merits. It's the task of dialectical argumentation theorists to formulate these rules in such a way that together they constitute a discussion procedure that is what we call problem valid as well as conventionally valid. The procedural rules proposed in pragmadialectics are claimed to be problem valid. Why is that? Because each of them contributes in a specific way to solving problems inherent in the process of resolving a difference of opinion. As I will explain later, their conventional validity is confirmed by systematic experimental research regarding their intersubjective acceptability. And that was reported in a book published last year, Fallacies and Judgments of Reasonableness. I published that together with my Amsterdam colleagues Bart Garsen and Bert Meufels. A procedure regulating the resolution of a difference of opinion must consist of a system of rules covering all speech acts that need to be carried out to resolve a difference of opinion. This means that the procedure should relate to all four stages that are to be distinguished in a critical discussion. The rules for conducting a critical discussion must state all the norms pertinent to resolving a difference of opinion on the merits. In principle, each of the pragmadialectical rules constitutes a distinct norm for critical discussion. Any move that is an infringement of any of these rules, whichever party performs it and at whatever stage in the discussion, is a possible threat to the resolution of the difference of opinion and must therefore, and in this particular sense, be regarded as fallacious. In this way, the use of the term fallacy is systematically connected with the rules for critical discussion. In the pragmadialectical approach, a fallacy is thus a hindrance or impediment to resolving a difference of opinion on the merits. The specific nature of a particular fallacy depends on the way in which it interferes with the resolution process. The pragmadialectical approach differentiates a functional variety of norms for judging fallaciousness, rather than considering the fallacies as belonging to an unstructured list of nominal categories inherited from the past, as is the case in the logical standard treatment, or considering the fallacies as all to be violations of the validity norm, as in the logic-centered approaches of someone like Woods. Different norms or different combinations of norms may be pertinent. A comparison shows that fallacies which were traditionally only nominally lumped together are now either shown to have something in common or clearly distinguished, whereas genuinely related fallacies that were separated are now brought together. In addition, the pragmadialectical approach also enables the analysis of thus far unrecognized and unnamed, what you could call new obstacles to resolving a difference of opinion on the merits. Now let me go on saying something about the conventional validity. Whereas the problem validity of the rules for critical discussion is an analytic theoretical question, determining whether the rules have conventional validity is a matter of empirical research. The two criteria are ordered hierarchically. It is pointless to examine the conventional validity of a set of rules if it's unclear whether they are indeed instrumental in achieving the goal they are meant to achieve. In order to investigate whether the pragmadialectical discussion rules may have conventional validity, we carried out a comprehensive research project encompassing a connected series of studies. That's reported in that book I mentioned. In these studies we investigated what judgments ordinary arguers have about argumentative moves put forward in argumentative discourse that argumentation theorists consider fallacious. And if their do laymen have the same view that argumentation theorists have? That's the basic question. And if their judgments differ substantially, how is this to be explained? We were interested in determining the agreements between the view of laymen and the theoretically motivated norms proposed by pragmadialecticians in their rules for critical discussion. In order to eliminate interfering variables from the research and to trace the influence of the various factors on their judgments about fallacious discussion moves, systematic experimental testing was needed. With the aid of a series of interlinked empirical tests, we attempted to determine systematically whether and to what extent the norms that ordinary arguers, generally speaking, claim to take into account when judging argumentative discourse, whether they are in accordance with the rules of the ideal model of critical discussion. We carried out experimental research with the help of constructed discussion fragments in which a particular pragmadialectical discussion rule was violated, or in other cases not violated, so that a fallacy was committed, or in these other cases not committed. Lay assessors who did not have any specific expertise in argumentation theory and had not been trained in this area were asked to give their judgments on the reasonableness of the discussion moves. They were requested to indicate their judgments on a so-called Likert scale with 7 classes, ranging from highly unreasonable to highly reasonable. This quantitative part of the hypothesis testing was completed with a more explorative part in which the respondents were asked to explain briefly some of their judgments. These qualitative data were then analyzed and interpreted with the aid of coding schemes to investigate whether the quantitative data were supported and to what extent ordinary arguers have some notion of the discussion norm that is violated. We decided to examine rule violations from all 4 discussion stages: confrontation, opening, argumentation and concluding stage. It proves that the average reasonableness score for discussion moves in which a discussion rule is violated is significantly lower than for moves in which no violation occurs. Overall, it can be concluded that fallacious moves are deemed less reasonable than non-fallacious moves, both in a relative sense and in an absolute sense. For a complete overview of the setup of these experiments and all the results, I refer you to the book by Van Eemeren, Garsen and Murphels from 2009. The theoretical question at issue in this research project, which was in fact the rationale of the empirical project, was whether or not, and if so, to what extent, the norms of ordinary arguers for judging the reasonableness of discussion moves correspond with the norms incorporated in the pragmadialectical rules for conducting a critical discussion. In other words, the interest at the heart of all our experimental tests was the potential conventional validity of the pragmadialectical discussion rules. The final conclusion of this comprehensive project is that all the results of the research indicate that the norms that ordinary arguers claim to use when judging the reasonableness of discussion contributions correspond to a large degree with the pragmadialectical norms for critical discussion. Now, although I can safely claim, that Hamlin's criticisms do not apply to the pragmadialectical theory of fallacies I have just sketched, in my view this theory is still not entirely satisfactory. The main reason is that it ignores the intriguing problem of the persuasiveness that fallacies may have, which is in fact why they deserve our attention. In the logical standard definition of fallacies as arguments that seem valid but are in fact not valid, the persuasiveness of the fallacies was hinted at by the use of the word seem. But since Hamlin issued the verdict that including this qualification brings in an undesirable element